The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingham. Section 72. Tedworth. Joseph Glanville, whose unjustly neglected essays contain some of the most magnificent germ thoughts of his age, wrote a curious work on witchcraft entitled Sadducismus Triumphatus. This work contains what its author styles a choice collection of modern relations, referring to more or less known cases of apparitions and similar supernatural phenomena. The chief of these relations is an account of the haunting of a house at Tedworth, Wiltshire, belonging to a Mr. John Mompesson, and considering the length of time the disturbances endured, the position of the people who investigated the case, and the unfathomable mystery in which it still remains, it may be considered one of the most remarkable instances of its kind on record. Following the particulars furnished by Glanville, who personally investigated the whole affair, the extraordinary story may be thus detailed. In March 1661, Mr. Mompesson, who was a man of good family and well endowed with worldly possessions, in his magisterial capacity, caused to be arrested and sent to Gloucester jail as a rogue and a vagabond, a wandering beggar, who had been going about the country annoying people by his vehement solicitations for alms, and disturbing their quiet by the noisy beating of a large drum. Mr. Mompesson committed him to prison, and had the drum consigned to the custody of the bailiff, and to this circumstance was attributed all the disturbances to which the unfortunate magistrate and his household were subsequently subjected. In the month following the vagrant's arrest, Mr. Mompesson had the occasion to visit London, but just before his departure the bailiff, for reasons not stated, took an opportunity of sending the man's drum to the magistrate's house. When he returned from his journey to the metropolis, Mr. Mompesson was informed by his wife that they had been much frightened during his absences by thieves, and that the house had been nearly broken into. He had not been home above 3 nights when noises similar to those that had terrified his family in his absence were again heard. It was a great knocking at the doors and outside of the house. Hereupon he got up, to follow Glanville's account, and went about the house with a brace of pistols in his hands. He opened the door where the great knocking was, and then he heard the noise at another door. He opened that also, and went out round his house, but could discover nothing. Only he still heard a strange noise and hollow sound. When he got back to bed, there was a thumping and drumming on the top of his house, which continued a good space, and then by degrees went off into the air. After this, according to Glanville, the noise of thumping and drumming was very frequent, usually 5 nights together, and then it would intermit 3. It was on the outside of the house, which most of it of board. It constantly came as they were going to sleep, whether early or late. After a month's disturbance without, it came into the room where the drum lay, 4 or 5 nights in 7, within half an hour after they were in bed, continuing almost 2. The sign of it, just before it came, was a hurling in the air over the house, and at its going off, the beating of a drum, like that at the breaking up of a guard. It continued in this room for the space of 2 months, which time Mr. Mompesson himself lay there to observe it. Mrs. Mompesson's confinement now taking place, the distressing noises politely refrained from manifesting themselves, but, after this civil cessation, as Glanville phrases it, of about 3 weeks, the disturbances returned, in a ruder manner than before, and followed and vexed the youngest children, beating their bedsteads with that violence that all present expected that they would fall to pieces. In laying hands on them, one could feel no blows, but might perceive them to shake exceedingly. For an hour together it would beat, the tattoo, and several other points of war, as well as any drummer. After this, they would hear a scratching under the children's bed, as if by something that had iron talons. It would lift the children up in their beds, follow them from one room to another, and for a while haunted none particularly but them. On the 5th of November, says Glanville, it made a mighty noise, and a servant observing 2 boards in the children's room seeming to move, he bid it give him one of them, upon which the board came, nothing moving it that he saw, within a yard of him. The man added, "Nay, let me have it in my hand," upon which the spirit, devil, or drummer pushed it towards him so close that he might touch it. This, continues Glanville, was in the daytime and seen by a whole roomful of people. That morning it left a sulphurous smell behind, in which was very offensive. At night, the minister, one Mr. Cragg, and several of the neighbours came to the house on a visit. Mr. Cragg went to prayers with them, kneeling at the children's bedside, where it then became very troublesome and loud. During prayer time the spirit withdrew into the cockloft, but returned as soon as prayers were done, and then, in sight of the company, the chairs walked about the room of themselves. The children's shoes were hurled over their heads, and every loose thing moved above the chamber. At the time a bedstaff was thrown against the minister, which hit him on the leg, but so favourably that a lock of wool could not have fallen more softly. As Mr. Mompesson found his youngest children were suffering so much from these persecutions, he had them removed, and lodged them at a house of a neighbour. His eldest daughter, who was about 10 years of age, was taken into her father's own room, where there had not been any disturbance for a month or so. As soon as she was in bed, continues the narration, the disturbance began there again, continuing 3 weeks, drumming and making other noises, and it was observed that it would answer exactly in drumming anything that was beaten or called for, just in the same way as with the modern spirit rappings it has been suggested. Among the many things noted or reported of this house haunting was, that when the noise was loudest and came with the most sudden and surprising violence, no dog about the house would move, though the knocking was oft so boisterous and rude that it hath been heard at a considerable distance in the fields, and awakened the neighbours in the village, none of whom lived very near Mr. Mompesson's bewitched abode. On one occasion, when the village blacksmith, a fellow who feared neither man nor devil, slept with John the footman, so that he might hear the supernatural noises and be cured of his incredulity, there came a noise in the room as if one had been shoeing a horse, and somewhat came, as it were, with a pair of pincers, snipping away at the sceptical blacksmith, the chief part of the night. Next day, the invisible being came panting like a dog out of breath, and a woman who was present taking up a staff to knock at it, the weapon, was caught suddenly out of her hand and thrown away, and company coming up, the room was presently filled with a gloomy, noisome smell, and was very hot, though without fire, in a very sharp and severe winter. It continued in the bed, panting and scratching for an hour and a half, and then went into the next room, when it knocked a little and seemed to rattle a chain. For 2 whole years, with some occasional intermissions, these disturbances continued, creating such intense excitement, not only in the vicinity of Tedworth, but all over the country, that, at last, the King sent a commission to specially investigate the circumstances, and to draw up and furnish with him a report of the whole affair. Whatever, however, may have been the cause during the visit of the Royal Commission, the disturbances ceased, and no manifestations took place. As to the quiet of the house when the courtiers were there, says Glanville, the intermission may have been accidental, or, perhaps, the demon was not willing to give so public a testimony of those transactions which might possibly convince those whom he had rather should continue in unbelief of his existence. However, no sooner were the Royal Commissioners gone than the mysterious annoyance recommenced, and was manifested in many unpleasant fashions. Sometimes it purred like a cat, or beat the children's legs black and blue. Once it put a long spike into Mr. Mompesson's bed, and a knife into his mother's, filled the porringers with ashes, hid a Bible in the grate, and turned the money in people's pockets black. On one occasion, a servant of Mr. Mompesson's averred that he had not only heard but seen the pertinacious demon, which came and stood at the foot of his bed. The exact shape and proportion of it he could not discover, but he saw a great body with 2 red and glaring eyes, which for some time were fixed steadily on him, and at length disappeared. In the meanwhile, Mr. Mompesson believed, and several of his friends appear to have had a similar opinion, that all the noises and troubles were occasioned by the imprisoned drummer who was still in jail at Gloucester. In confirmation, as it were, of this idea, the following evidence is given. During the time of the knocking, says Glanville, when many were present, a gentleman of the company said, Satan, if the drummer set thee to work, give 3 knocks and no more. Which it did, very distinctly, and stopped. Then the gentleman knocked to see if it would answer him as it was wont, but it did not. For farther trial, he bid it, for confirmation, if it were the drummer, to give 5 knocks and no more that night, which it did, and let the house quiet all the night after. This was done in the presence of Sir Thomas Chamberlain of Oxford and divers others. In the meantime, the drummer being visited one day in jail by a person from the neighbourhood of Tedworth, he asked what was the news in Wiltshire, and, so it is alleged, whether people did not talk a great deal about a drumming in a gentleman's house there. The visitor replied that he had heard of nothing, to which the drummer responded, I have done it. I have thus plagued him, and he shall never be quiet until he hath made me satisfaction for taking away my drum. Mr. Mompesson had the drummer taken up again, and this time for felony, for the supposed witchcraft about his house. The grand jury found a true bill against the man, but he was acquitted, his connection with the disturbances not being proved. What subsequently became of the drummer is rather uncertain, but that he was eventually tried and convicted of witchcraft at Salisbury appears to be a fact, and also that he was sentenced to transportation for the crime. The leniency of the sentence is said to have excited no little surprise at that time, the offence of which he was found guilty generally being punished by death. Hitherto, the history of the haunting at Tedworth is only a recapitulation of what Glanville took down from the mouths of other people. But his own personal experiences should not be ignored in any account of this extraordinary affair. In January 1662, he visited the scene of the disturbance himself, and furnishes the following record of what he observed. About this time I went to the house on purpose to inquire the truth of those passages, of which there was so loud a report. It had ceased from its drumming and ruder noises before I came thither, but most of the more remarkable circumstances before related were confirmed to me there by several of the neighbours together, who had been present at them. At this time it used to haunt the children, and that as soon as they were laid in bed. They went to bed that night I was there, about 8 of the clock, when a maid servant, coming down from them, told us it was come. The neighbours that were there, and 2 ministers, who had seen and heard divers times, went away, but Mr. Mompesson and I, and a gentleman that came with me, went up. I heard a strange scratching as we went up the stairs, and when we came into the room, I perceived it was just behind the bolster of the children's bed, and seemed to be against the tick. It was loud scratching, as with one long nails could make upon a bolster. There were 2 little modest girls in the bed, between 7 and 11 years old, as I guessed. I saw their hands out of the clothes, and they could not contribute to the noise that was behind their heads. They had been used to it, and had still somebody or other in the chamber with them, and therefore seemed not to be much affrighted. I, standing at the bed's head, thrust my hand behind the bolster, directing it to the place whence the noise seemed to come. Whereupon the noise ceased there, and was heard in another part of the bed. But when I had taken out my hand, it returned, and was heard in the same place as before. I had been told that it would imitate noises, and make trial by scratching several times upon the sheet, as 5 and 7 and 10, which it followed, and still stopped at my number. I searched under and behind the bed, turned at the clothes to the bedcords, grasped the bolster, sounded the wall behind, and made all the search that possibly I could, to find if there were any trick, contrivance, or common cause of it. The like did my friend, but we could discover nothing, so that I was then verily persuaded, and am so still, that the noise was made by some demon or spirit. After it had scratched about an hour and a half or more, it went into the midst of the bed, under the children, and then seemed to pant like a dog out of breath, very loudly. I put my hand upon the place, and felt the bed bearing up against it, as if something within had thrust it up. I grasped the feathers to feel if any living thing were in it. I looked under and everywhere about to see if there were any dog or cat or any such creature in the room, and so we all did, but found nothing. The motion it caused by this panting was so strong that it shook the rooms and windows very sensibly. It continued more than half an hour, while my friend and I stayed in the room, and as long after as we were told. It will, I know, be said by some that my friend and I were under some affright, and so fancied noises and sights that were not. This is the eternal evasion. But if it be possible to know how a man is affected when in fear and when unaffected, I certainly know for mine own part that during the whole time of my being in the room and in the house, I was under no more affrightment than I am while I write this relation, and, if I know that I am now awake, and that I see the objects that are before me, I know that I heard and saw the particulars that I have told. Thus ends the Reverend Joseph Glanville's account of this extraordinary affair, and from which Mr. Mompesson, as he remarks, suffered by it in his name, in his estate, in all his affairs, and in the general peace of his family. Because, as the same authority points out, the unbelievers, in the matter of spirits and witches, took him for an impostor. Many others judged the permission of such an extraordinary evil to be the judgment of God upon him for some notorious wickedness or impiety. Thus his name was continually exposed to censure, and his estate suffered by the concourse of people from all parts to his house, by the diversion it gave him from his affairs, by the discouragement of servants, by reasons of which he could hardly get anyone to live with him, to which I add the continual hurry that his family was in, the affrights, and the watchings and disturbance of his whole house, in which himself must needs to be most concurred. I say, if these things are considered, there will be little reason to think he would have any interest to put a cheat upon the world, in which he would most of all have injured and abused himself. Mr. Mompesson, writing on the 8th of November, 1672, or 10 years after the events recorded had taken place, besides pointing out that no discovery had been made of any cheat, declared most solemnly that he knew of none, and as he had, indeed, testified at the assizes. If the world will not believe it, he concluded, it shall be indifferent to me, praying God to keep me from the same or the like affliction.
Section 77. Westminster, King Street. In his Miscellanies, Aubrey cites the singular narrative of Captain Henry Bell, originally given in the preface to the translation of Luther's Table Talk. Captain Bell begins by declaring that whilst employed beyond the seas in various state affairs for King Charles II. and his successor James II., he had heard much lamentation made over the great destruction, by burning and otherwise, of Martin Luther's Discourses. This work, which was supposed to have largely promoted the Reformation, was condemned by Pope Gregory XIII. And placed under the ban of the Empire by Rudolph III. This latter monarch ordered that all printed copies of the work should be burned, and that any person retaining a copy would be liable to the punishment of death. In consequence of this rigorous edict, and the stringency with which it was enforced, in a little while no copies were obtainable. A certain Caspar von Spar, however, according to Captain Bell's account, accidentally discovered a copy, in 1626, which had escaped the wholesale destruction the work had suffered. As the prosecution of Protestantism still continued, this gentleman was afraid to retain possession of the interdicted book, and yet, unwilling to destroy it, thought of Captain Bell. Knowing that he was thoroughly acquainted with German, he forwarded him the wonderfully preserved book, earnestly impressing upon him the utility of translating it into English. Captain Bell did not appear to be in any great haste to comply with this request, but, nevertheless, took the work in hand, and many times began to translate the same, as he remarks. But always I was hindered therein, being called upon about other business, insomuch that by no possible means I could remain by that work. About 6 weeks after he had received the book from Germany, it fell out, to cite his own words, that being in bed with my wife, one night between 12 and 1 o'clock, she being asleep, but myself yet awake, there appeared unto me an ancient man, standing at my bedside, arrayed in white, having a long and broad white beard hanging down to his girdle, who, taking me by the right ear, spake these words following unto me: Sirrah, will not you take time to translate that book, which is sent unto you out of Germany? I will provide for you both place and time to do it. And then he vanished out of my sight. Whereupon, being much affrighted, Captain Bell continues, I fell into an extreme sweat, insomuch that, my wife awaking, she asked me what I ailed. I told her what I had seen and heard, but I never did heed or regard visions nor dreams, and so the same fell soon out of my mind. Then about a fortnight after I had seen the vision, on a Sunday, I went to Whitehall to hear the sermon, after which ended I returned to my lodging, which was then in King Street, Westminster, and sitting down to dinner with my wife, 2 messengers were sent from the council board to carry me to the keeper of the gatehouse at Westminster, there to be safely kept until further orders from the lords of the council. This was done, avers Bell, without any cause being shown, but his real offence, according to Aubrey, was that he had much importuned the Lord Treasurer for considerable arrears which were due to him, and which that official not being willing to discharge, clapped him up into prison. Be the cause what it may, Bell was detained in close confinement for 10 years, 5 of which, he states, he spent in translating the work of Luther above referred to. As he quaintly remarks, I found the words very true which the old man in the aforesaid vision said unto me. I will shortly provide you both place and time to translate it.
Section 78. Willington Mill. Willington is a hamlet lying in a deep valley between Newcastle-on-Tyne and North Shields. 30 years ago it consisted of a parsonage, some few cottages, a mill, and the miller's house. The mill is, or was 30 years ago, a large steam flour mill, like a factory, and near it, but completely detached, was the miller's house. Messrs. Unthank and Proctor were the proprietors and workers of the mill, and Mr. Joseph Proctor, one of the partners, resided in the house adjoining it. Mr. Proctor, a respectable member of the Society of Friends, a man in the prime of life, was married to a lady belonging to the same religious fraternity, and was a father of several young children. The house in which Mr. Proctor resided was built about the beginning of the present century, and as described by Mr. Howitt in 1847, had nothing spectral in its appearance, although located in a somewhat wild-looking region just off the River Tyne. The railway runs close by it, and engines connected with coal mines are constantly at work in its vicinity. When rumours as to the miller's residence being haunted began to spread, Mr. Proctor, it is alleged, although evidently much troubled by the disturbances in his dwelling, was unwillingly to give publicity to his troubles. Apparently, this unwillingness wore off eventually, as in course of time Mr. Proctor frequently communicated with the press on matters connected with the singular events at Willington. The chief published authority for an account of the haunted house at Willington would appear to be a pamphlet reprinted in the local historian's table book, whence Mr. Howitt and Mrs. Crowe derive their particulars, and whence the following statement is chiefly taken. We have visited the house in question, says the writer of the pamphlet referred to, and it may not be irrelevant to mention that it is quite detached from the mill, or any other premises, and has no cellaring under it. The proprietor of the house, who lives in it, declines to make public the particulars of the disturbance to which he has been subjected, and it must be understood that the account of the visit we are about to lay before our readers is derived from a friend to whom Mr. Drury presented a copy of his correspondence on the subject, with the power to make such use of it as he thought proper. We learned that the house had been reputed, at least one room in it, to have been haunted 40 years ago, and had afterwards been undisturbed for a long period, during some years of which quietude the present occupant lived in it unmolested. We are also informed that, about the time that the premises were building, there were reports of some deeds of darkness having been committed by some employed about them. The writer of this account, after alluding to the strange things seen and heard, or said to have been seen and heard, by various persons in the neighbourhood, proceeds to quote the following correspondence which, he remarks, passed between individuals of undoubted veracity. The copy of the first letter on the subject, written by Mr. Edward Drury of Sunderland to Mr. Proctor, reads thus: 17th of June, 1840. Sir, having heard from indisputable authority, viz., that of my excellent friend Mr. Davidson, of Low Willington, farmer, that you and your family are disturbed by the most unaccountable noises at night, I beg leave to tell you that I have read attentively Wesley's account of such things, but with, I must confess, no great belief. But on account of this report coming from one of your sect, which I admire for candour and simplicity, my curiosity is excited to a high pitch, which I would fain satisfy. My desire is to remain alone in the house all night, with no companion but my own watchdog, in which, as far as courage and fidelity are concerned, I place much more reliance than upon any 3 young gentlemen I know of. And it is also my hope that if I have a fair trial, I shall be able to unravel this mystery. Mr. Davidson, will you give every satisfaction if you take the trouble to inquire of him concerning me? I am, and so on. In response to this application, Mr. Proctor sent the following note: Joseph Proctor's respects to Edward Drury, whose note he received a few days ago, expressing a wish to pass a night in his house at Willington. As the family is going from home on the 23rd instant, and one of Unthank and Proctor's men will sleep in the house, if E.D. feels inclined to come, on or after the 24th, to spend a night, he is at liberty to do so, with or without his faithful dog, which, by the by, can be of no possible use except as company. At the same time, J.P. thinks it's best to inform him that particular disturbances are far from frequent at present, being only occasional and quite uncertain, and, therefore, the satisfaction of E.D.'s curiosity must be considered as problematical. The best chance will be afforded by his sitting up alone in the 3rd story till it be fairly daylight, say 2 or 3 a.m. Willington, 6th month, 21st, 1840. J.P. will leave word with T. Morn, foreman, to admit E.D. The Proctors left home on the 23rd of June, leaving the house in charge of an old servant who, being out of place on account of ill health, was induced to undertake the duty during their absence. On the 3rd of July, Mr. Proctor returned home, having been recalled by business matters, and on the evening of the same day Mr. Drury and a companion arrived unexpectedly. After the house had been locked up for the night, every corner of it underwent minute examination on the part of the visitors. The room out of which the apparition was accustomed to issue was found to be too shallow to contain any person. Mr. Drury and his companion were well provided with lights, and satisfied themselves that there was no one in the house besides Mr. Proctor, his servant, and themselves. Some correspondence which subsequently took place between Mr. Drury and Mr. Proctor, with respect to the ill effects of what he did see had had upon the former, and the request of the latter for a detailed account of his visitor's experience, need not be given, as the following letter, copied verbatim, will fully describe what Mr. Drury says he really saw and heard. Sunderland, July 13th, 1840. Dear Sir, I hereby, according to promise in my last letter, forward you a true account of what I heard and saw at your house, in which I was led to pass the night from various rumours circulated by most respectable parties, particularly from an account by my esteemed friend Mr. Davison, whose name I mentioned to you in a former letter. Having received your sanction to visit your mysterious dwelling, I went on the 3rd of July, accompanied by a friend of mine, T. Hudson. This was not according to promise, nor in accordance with my first intent, as I wrote you I would come alone, but I felt gratified at your kindness in not alluding to the liberty I had taken, as it ultimately proved for the best. I must here mention that, not expecting you at home, I had in my pocket a brace of pistols, determining in my mind to let one of them drop before the miller, as if by accident, for the fear he should presume to play tricks upon me. But, after my interview with you, I felt there was no occasion for weapons, and did not load them after you had allowed us to inspect as minutely as we pleased every portion of the house. I sat down on the 3rd-story landing, fully expecting to account for any noises that I might hear in a philosophical manner. This was about 11 o'clock p.m. About 10 minutes to 12 we both heard a noise, as if a number of people were pattering with their bare feet upon the floor, and yet, so singular was the noise, that I could not minutely determine from whence it proceeded. A few minutes afterwards we heard a noise, as if someone was knocking with his knuckles among our feet. This was followed by a hollow cough from the very room which the apparition proceeded. The only noise after this was if a person was rustling against the wall in coming upstairs. At 1:15 I told my friend that, feeling a little cold, I would like to go to bed, as we might hear the noise equally well there. He replied that he would not go to bed till daylight. I took up a note which I had accidentally dropped and began to read it, after which I took out my watch to ascertain the time, and found that it wanted 10 minutes to 1. In taking my eyes from the watch, they became riveted upon a closet door, which I distinctly saw open, and saw also the figure of a female, attired in greyish garments, with a head inclining downwards, and one hand pressed upon the chest as if in pain, and the other, viz., the right hand, extended towards the floor with the index finger pointing downwards. It advanced with an apparently cautious step across the floor towards me. Immediately as it approached my friend, who was slumbering, its right hand was extended towards him. I then rushed at it, giving, as Mr. Proctor states, a most awful yell, but, instead of grasping it, I fell upon my friend, and I recollect nothing distinctly for nearly 3 hours afterwards. I have since learnt that I was carried downstairs in an agony of fear and terror. I hereby certify that the above account is strictly true and correct in every respect. Edward Drury. The appearance in print of Mr. Drury's letter naturally created a great sensation. Mr. Proctor received a large number of letters in consequence of the publication, many of them, it is alleged, being from individuals in various positions of society, informing him that their residences were, and had long been, subjected to similar disturbances to those alleged to trouble his. Other instances of the way in which Mr. Proctor's house was haunted are recorded by Mr. Howitt. On one occasion, another apparition was seen by 4 witnesses, who were enabled to watch its proceedings for the space of 10 minutes. They were on the outside of the building, and they beheld the apparition of a bare-headed man, in a flowing robe like a surplice, gliding backwards and forwards about 3 feet from the floor, or level with the bottom of the 2nd-story window, seeming to enter the wall on each side, thus presenting the spectators with a side view in passing. It then stood still in the window, and a part of the figure came through both the blind, which was closed down, and the window, as its luminous body intercepted the view of the framework of the window. It was semi-transparent and as bright as a star, diffusing a radiance all around. As it grew more dim, it assumed a blue tinge, and gradually faded away from the head downwards. The foreman, one of the spectators, passed close to the house under the window, and also went up to inform the family, but found the house locked up. There was no moonlight, says the account, nor a ray of light visible anywhere about, and no person near. One of Mrs. Proctor's brothers, a gentleman in middle life and of a particularly sensible, sedate, and candid disposition, says Mr. Howitt, assured me that he had himself, on a visit there, been disturbed by the strangest noises, that he had resolved, before going, that if any noises occurred he would speak, and demand of the invisible actor who he was and why he came thither. But the occasion came, and he found himself unable to fulfil his intention. As he lay in bed one night, he heard a heavy step ascend the stairs towards his room, and someone striking, as it were, with a thick stick on the banisters as he went along. It came to his door, and he essayed to call, but his voice died in his throat. He then sprang from his bed, and, opening the door, found no one there, but now heard the same heavy steps deliberately descending, though perfectly invisible, the steps before his face, and accompanying the descent with the same loud blows on the banisters. A thorough search was at once made of the premises in the company of Mr. Proctor, but nothing was discovered that would account for the mysterious noises. From two young ladies who, whilst on a visit to Mr. Proctor's, were annoyed by the apparition, Mr. Howitt received this terrifying account of their experiences. The first night, as they were sleeping in the same bed, they felt the bed lifted up beneath them. Of course they were much alarmed. They feared lest someone had concealed himself there for the purpose of robbery. They gave an alarm. Search was made, but nothing was found. On another night their bed was violently shaken, and the curtains suddenly hoisted up all around to the very tester, as if pulled by cords, and as rapidly let down again several times. Search again produced no evidence of the cause. The next day they had the curtains totally removed from the bed, resolving to sleep without them, as they felt as though evil eyes were lurking behind them. The consequences of this, however, were still more striking and terrific. The following night, as they happened to awake, and the chamber was light enough, for it was summer, to see everything in it, they both saw a female figure of a misty substance and bluish-grey hue come out of the wall at the bed's head and through the headboard in a horizontal position and lean over them. They saw it most distinctly. They saw it as a female figure come out of and again pass into the wall. Their terror became intense, and one of the sisters from that night refused to sleep any more in the house, but took refuge in the house of the foreman during her stay, the other shifting her quarters to another part of the house. Among the various forms in which these disturbances were manifested at Mr. Proctor's house were, according to the statements made by different persons to Mr. Howitt, a noise like that of a pavior with his hammer thumping on the floor. At other times similar noises are heard coming down the stairs. Frequently are heard coughs, sighs, and groans, as of a person in distress, and sometimes there is a sound of a number of little feet pattering on the floor of the upper chamber when the female apparition has more particularly exhibited itself, and which, for that reason, is solely used as a lumber room. Here these little footsteps, says the narrative, may be often heard as if careering a child's carriage about, which in bad weather is kept up there. Sometimes, again, it utters the most blood-curdling laughter, whilst it does not even confine itself to making night hideous, but appears in broad daylight. On one occasion, a young lady assured me, says Mr. Howitt, she opened the door in answer to a knock, the housemaid being absent, and a lady in fawn-coloured silk entered and proceeded upstairs. As the young lady, of course, supposed it to be a neighbour come to make a morning call on Mrs. Proctor, she followed her up to the drawing-room, where, however, to her astonishment, she did not find her, nor was anything more seen of her. Two apparitions appear to have haunted the house, one in the likeness of a man, as already described, which is luminous and passes through the walls as if they offered no solid obstacles to it, and which, is well known to the neighbours by the name of Old Geoffrey. The other is a figure of a female in greyish garments, as described by Mr. Drury. She is said to be sometimes seen sitting wrapped in a sort of mantle, with her head depressed and her hands crossed on her lap. The most terrible fact is that she is without eyes. After enduring these terrible annoyances for some years, Mr. Proctor, apprehensive of the ill effect they might have upon his children, says Mr. Howitt quitted Willington and removed to North Shields, and subsequently to Tynemouth. At neither of these new abodes was he troubled by any similar manifestations. Mr. Proctor states that a strange lady, strange to the district, being thrown into a clairvoyant state and asked to go to the mill, she described the priest and the grey lady, the two apparitions which haunted it. She also added that the priest had refused to allow the female ghost to confess a deadly crime committed at the spot many years ago, and that this was the troubling cause of the poor woman's apparition.
Section number 79. Windsor Castle. Windsor, like most of our old castles, whether the residences of royalty, nobility, or commonalty, has had its apparitions. It is well known that previous to the assassination of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, by Felton, an apparition of the Duke's father, Sir George Villiers, had appeared to and sent him warning of his approaching fate by a certain person. But it has created endless controversy that the accounts of this apparition, as recorded by Aubrey, Lord Clarendon, and others, are so various and varied. It never appears to have occurred to anyone to remark that it is just as probable that the apparition may have appeared to 3 or more persons at different times and places as to one, and that, looking at the different stories from this point of view, all the alleged discrepancies disappear, and, in fact, the various records of the marvellous story, instead of contradicting, serve to corroborate one another. In Notes and Queries for July 1860, Mr. Hargrave Jennings published a very curious and circumstantial account of the appearance, on 3 separate occasions, of an apparition of Sir George Villiers to one Parker, formerly a servant of Sir George, and at that time in the employment of his son, the Duke. This letter, originally published some few years after the Duke's death, is of considerable interest, but as it in many respects parallels other and less accessible accounts, it may be passed over in favour of the story as told by Lord Clarendon and Aubrey. According to the account furnished by the former in his History of the Rebellion, the apparition of Sir George Villiers appeared to an officer in the King's Wardrobe in Windsor Castle. This man, says Clarendon, was of a good reputation for honesty and discretion, and at the time referred to was about 50 years of age. He had in his youth been bred in a school in the parish where Sir George Villiers, the father of the Duke, lived, and had been much cherished and obliged in that season of his age by the said Sir George, whom afterwards he never saw. About 6 months before the miserable end of the Duke of Buckingham, about midnight, this man being in his bed at Windsor where his office was, and in good health, there appeared to him at the side of his bed a man of a very venerable aspect, who drew the curtains of his bed, and fixing his eyes upon him, asked him if he knew him. The poor man, half dead with fright and apprehension, being asked a second time whether he remembered him, and having in that time called to his memory the presence of Sir George Villiers, and the very clothes he used to wear, in which at that time he seemed to be habited, he answered him that he thought him to be that person. He replied he was in the right, he was the same, and that he expected a service from him, which was, that he should go from him to his son, the Duke of Buckingham, and tell him if he did not somewhat to ingratiate himself with the people, or at least to abate the extreme malice which they had against him, he would be suffered to live but a short time. After this discourse he disappeared, and the poor man, if he had been at all waking, slept very well till morning, when he believed all this to be a dream, and considered it no otherwise. The next night, or shortly after, the same person appeared to him again, in the same place, and about the same time of the night, with an aspect a little more severe than before, and asked him whether he had done as he required of him, and perceiving he had not, gave him very severe reprehensions, told him he expected more compliance from him, and that if he did not perform his commands, he should enjoy no more peace of mind, but should always be pursued by him, upon which he promised him to obey. But the next morning, waking out of a good sleep, though he was exceedingly perplexed with the lively representation of all particulars to his memory, he was willing still to persuade himself that he had only dreamed, and considered that he was a person at such a distance from the Duke that he knew not how to gain admission to his presence, much less had any hope of being believed in what he should say. So he spent some time in thinking what he should do, and in the end he resolved to do nothing in the matter. The same person appeared to him the third time with a terrible countenance, and bitterly reproached him for not performing what he had promised to do. The poor man had by this time recovered the courage to tell him that in truth he had deferred the execution of his commands upon considering how difficult a thing it would be for him to get any access to the Duke, having acquaintance with no person about him, and if he should obtain admission to him, he should never be able to persuade him that he was sent in such a manner, that he should at least be thought to be mad, or to be set on and employed by his own, or the malice of other men, to abuse the Duke, and so he should be sure to be undone. The apparition replied, as he had done before, that he should never find rest till he had performed what he required, and therefore he were better to dispatch it, that the access to his son was known to be very easy, and that few men waited long for him. As for his gaining credit, he would tell him 2 or 3 particulars which he charged him never to mention to any person living but to the Duke himself, and he should no sooner hear them but he should believe all the rest he said, and so, repeating his threats, he left him. In the morning, the poor man, more confirmed by the last appearance, made his journey to London, where the court then was. He was very well known to Sir Ralph Freeman, one of the masters of request, who married a lady that was nearly allied to the Duke, and was himself well received by him. To him this man went, and though he did not acquaint him with all the particulars, he said enough to let him know there was something extraordinary in it, and the knowledge he had of the sobriety and discretion of the man made the more impression on him. He desired that by his means he might be brought to the Duke in such a place and in such a manner as should be thought fit, affirming that he had much to say to him, and of such a nature as would require much privacy, and some time and patience in the hearing. Sir Ralph promised that he would first speak to the Duke of him, and then he should understand his pleasure. Accordingly, the first opportunity he did inform him of the reputation and honesty of the man, and then what he desired, and of all he knew of the matter. The Duke, according to his usual openness and condescension, told him that he was the next day early to hunt with the king, that his horses should attend him at Lambeth Bridge, where he should land by 5 o'clock in the morning, and, if the man attended him there at that hour, he would walk and speak with him as long as should be necessary. Sir E.F. carried the man with him the next morning, and presented him to the Duke at his landing, who received him courteously, and walked aside in conference near an hour. None but his own servants being at that hour in that place, and they and Sir E.F. at such a distance that they could not hear a word, though the Duke sometimes spoke loud and with great commotion, which Sir Ralph the more easily perceived, because he kept his eyes always fixed upon the Duke, having procured the conference upon somewhat he knew there was of extraordinary. The man told him, in his return over the water, that when he mentioned those particulars, which were to gain him credit, the substance whereof, he said, he durst not impart to him, the Duke's colour changed, and he swore he could come at that knowledge only by the devil, for that those particulars were only known to himself and to one person more, who he was sure would never speak of it. The Duke pursued his purpose of hunting, but was observed to ride all the morning with great pensiveness and in deep thoughts, without any delight in the exercise he was upon, and before the morning was spent, he left the field and alighted at his mother's lodgings in Whitehale, with whom he was shut up for the space of 2 or 3 hours, the noise of their discourse frequently reaching the ears of those who attended in the next rooms. And when the Duke left her, his countenance appeared full of trouble, with a mixture of anger, a countenance that was never before observed in him in any conversation with her, towards whom he had a profound reverence. And the Countess herself, for though she was married to a private gentleman, Sir Thomas Compton, she had been created Countess of Buckingham shortly after her son had first assumed that title, was, at the Duke's leaving, found overwhelmed in tears and in the highest agony imaginable. Whatever there was in all this, says Clarendon, it is a notorious truth, that when the news of the Duke's murder, which happened within a few months after, was brought to his mother, she seemed not in the least degree surprised, but received it as if she had foreseen it, nor did afterwards express such a degree of sorrow as was expected from such a mother for the loss of such a son. This is the story, as repeated by the grave historian of the so-called rebellion, with the assurance that it is upon a better foundation of credit than usually such discourses are founded upon. Other versions of the mysterious affair were published some few years after the Duke of Buckingham's murder, and although the discrepancies in them have never been explained, still there has been a sufficient similarity in the leading features of the narratives to cause most people to imagine that they were all derived from one source. But this does not necessarily follow. If the apparition appeared to different people and at different times, and it does not seem more wonderful that it should have manifested itself to two or more individuals than to one, the variations in the tales told of its appearance are readily explicable. Lilly, the astrologer, notoriously published a false version of the story, and it was for that reason only that Sir Edmund Wyndham, who was fully acquainted with the facts of the case, gave the narrative that ultimately passed into the hands of Aubrey, the antiquary, and by him is thus told. To one Mr. Towes, who had been schoolfellow with Sir George Villiers, the father of the first Duke of Buckingham, and was his friend and neighbour, as he lay in his bed awake, and it was daylight, came into his chamber the phantom of his dear friend Sir George Villiers. Said Mr. Towes to him, "Why, you are dead. What make you here?" said the knight. "'Tam dead, but cannot rest in peace for the wickedness and abomination of my son George at court. I do appear to you to tell him of it, and to advise and to hoard him from his evil ways," said Mr. Towes. "The Duke will not believe me, but will say that I am mad or dote," said Sir George. "Go to him from me, and tell him by such a token, a mole, that he had in some secret place," which none but himself knew of. According, Mr. Towes went to the Duke, who laughed at his message. At his return home, the phantom appeared again, and told him that the Duke would be stabbed a quarter of a year after. "And the warning which you will have of your death will be that your nose will fall a-bleeding." All which accordingly fell out so. "This account I have had in the main," says Aubrey, "from 2 or 3, but Sir William Dugdale affirms what I have here taken from him to be true, and that the apparition told him of several things to come, which proved true, such as of a prisoner in the Tower that shall be honourably delivered." This Mr. Towes had so often the ghost of his old friend appear to him, that it was not at all terrible to him. He was surveyor of the works at Windsor by the favour of the Duke. Being then, such as at that time, sitting in the hall, he cried out, "The Duke of Buckingham is stabbed!" He was stabbed at that very moment. This relation Sir William Dugdale had from Mr. Pine, neighbour to Mr. Towes. They were sworn brothers. Sir Edmund Wyndham married the daughter of Mr. Pine, and possessed a large roll of manuscript, wherein Mr. Towes had recorded the particulars of his conferences with the apparition.
Section 81. Yorkshire Hall. In March 1880, a communication was handed to the editor of Notes and Queries by a well-known contributor of that invaluable publication. The narrative it contained was headed "Ghost or Nightmare," clearly an incorrect title, if any credence is to be given to its author. The young lady who indited the communication is described as intelligent, whilst her hereditary acumen is declared to be such as precludes altogether the possibility of any self-deceit in regard to her own personal experiences as narrated by herself. Moreover, as it is pointed out, hers is not the only evidence on the subject, as the reader will notice. The contributor to Notes and Queries remarks that it is in the conviction that the statement contains matter of unquestionable interest to every sort of thinker, that it is submitted to the consideration of his readers, evidently acquainted not only with the fair communicator of the narrative, but also with the locality to which his friend refers. H.C.C. states that the scene of the occurrences is an old mansion in the north of Yorkshire, cosy and cheerful, though large and lonely in point of sight. The young lady's experiences in this haunted dwelling are thus graphically described. "What I am going to relate happened to myself while staying with some north country cousins last July at their house in Yorkshire. I had spent a few days there in the summer of the previous year, but without then hearing or seeing anything out of the common. On my second visit, arriving early in the afternoon, I went out boating with some of the family, spent a very jolly evening, and finally went to bed, a little tired, perhaps, with the day's work, but not the least nervous. I slept soundly until between 3 and 4, just when the day was beginning to break. I had been awake for a short time, when suddenly the door of my bedroom opened and shut again, rather quickly. I fancied it might be one of the servants, and called out, "Come in." After a short time the door opened again, but no one came in, at least no one that I could see. Almost at the same time that the door opened for the second time, I was a little startled by the rustling of some curtains belonging to a hanging wardrobe which stood by the side of the bed. The rustling continued, and I was seized with a most uncomfortable feeling, not exactly of fright, but a strange, unearthly sensation that I was not alone. I had had that feeling for some minutes, when I saw at the foot of the bed a child, about 7 or 9 years old. The child seemed as if it were on the bed, and came gliding towards me as I lay. It was the figure of a little girl, in her night dress, a little girl with dark hair and a very white face. I tried to speak to her, but could not. She came slowly on up to the top of the bed, and I then saw her face clearly. She seemed in great trouble. Her hands were clasped, and her eyes were turned up with a look of entreaty, an almost agonized look. Then, slowly unclasping her hands, she touched me on the shoulder. The hand felt icy cold, and while I strove to speak, she was gone. I felt more frightened after the child was gone than before, and began to be very anxious for the time when the servant would make her appearance. Whether I slept again or not, I hardly know. But by the time the servant did come, I had almost persuaded myself that the whole affair was nothing but a very vivid nightmare. However, when I came down to breakfast, there were many remarks made about my not looking well. It was observed that I was pale. In answer I told my cousins that I had had a most vivid nightmare, and I remarked if I was a believer in ghosts I should imagine I had seen one. Nothing more was said at the time upon this subject, except that my host, who was a doctor, observed that I had better not sleep in the room again, at any rate not alone. So the following night one of my cousins slept in the same room with me. Neither of us saw or heard anything out of the way during that night or the early morning. That being the case, I persuaded myself that what I had seen had been only imagination. And much against everybody's expressed wish, I insisted the next night on sleeping in the room again, and alone. Accordingly, having retired again to the same room, I was kneeling down at the bedside to say my prayers, when exactly the same dread as before came over me. The curtains of the wardrobe swayed about, and I had the same sensation as previously that I was not alone. I felt too frightened to stir, when, luckily for me, one of my cousins came in for something which she had left. On looking at me, she exclaimed, "Have you seen anything?" I said no, but told her how I felt, and, without much persuasion being necessary, I left the room with her, and never returned to it. When my hostess learnt what had happened, as she did immediately, she told me I must not sleep in that room again, as the nightmare had made such an impression on me. I should imagine, she said, all sorts of things and make myself quite ill. I went to another room, and during the rest of my visit, a week, I was not troubled by any reappearance of the little girl. On leaving, my cousin, the eldest daughter of the doctor, went on a visit with me to the house of an uncle of mine in the same county. We stayed there for about a fortnight, and during that time the little girl was alluded to only as my nightmare. In this I afterwards found there was a little reticence, for, just before leaving my uncle's, my cousin said to me, "I must tell you something I have been longing to tell you ever since I left home, but my father desired me not to tell you, as, not being very strong, you might be too frightened. Your nightmare was not a nightmare at all, but the apparition of a little girl." She then went on to tell me that this little girl had been seen 3 times before by 3 different members of the family. But as this was some 9 or 10 years since, they had almost ceased to think anything about it until I related my experiences on the morning after the first night of my second visit. My cousin further went on to tell me that her younger sister, whilst in bed, had one morning about daybreak, to her great surprise, seen a little girl with dark hair, standing with her back to her, looking out of the window. She took this figure for her little sister, and spoke to it. The child not replying, or moving from her position, she called out to it, "It's no use standing like that. I know you. You can't play tricks with me." On looking round, however, she saw that her little sister, the one she thought she was addressing, and who was sleeping with her, had not moved from the bed. Almost at the same time, the child passed from the window into the room of her, my cousin's, sister A, and the latter, as she afterwards declared, distinctly saw the figure of a child with dark hair standing by the side of a table in her room. She spoke to it, and it instantly disappeared. The little girl was subsequently again seen, for the last time before I saw it, by my cousin's father, Dr. H. It was in the early daylight of a summer's morning, and he was going upstairs to his room, having just returned from a professional visit. On this occasion he saw the same child. He noticed its dark hair, running up the stairs immediately before him, until it reached his room and entered it. When he got into the room, it was gone. Thus the apparition has been seen 3 times by the family, and once by me. I am the only one, however, that has seen its face. It has also never been seen twice in the same room by anyone else. No refutation, explanation, or continuation of this mysterious matter appears to have been attempted as yet